Thank you so much for joining us, Fidel. Today, we're talking about current issues over land, so Aboriginal rights, land claims, and I guess a good place to start would be discussing treaties and what treaties are and what that means.
I'm going to say that, we're very ethnocentric. We think how we do things, and people, especially North America, we think that, we know everything. But I'm going to say that we're subjective because, especially in law enforcement, when you look at treaties, it's an agreement. So, you know what? We have defined what's right or wrong, but a treaty is like an agreement between two or more parties. Um, some people will say, hey, you know what? Actually, here, hold on. Here's an agreement that I have. Here's a lease, and the lease at the end of the day is signed. So this makes this a agreement or treaty. But treaties go a little bit further. They're actually between, let's say, state actors or government entities, and the First Nations are considered. They consider themselves as a their own sovereign entity. However, what we need to know and be careful of is that just like some people have an agreement by shaking hands, or agreements with First Nations and between the nations themselves of different First Nations are done oral. History is oral. It's actually been seen that when they went back to look at the Jesuits that were with the First Nations back 300 years ago, and they looked at the records of the Jesuits, I believe it was the Jesuits, yeah. Anyway, they were able to see that, hey, the First Nations people said that treaties were oral and everything is done orally. They were actually able to look at the notes by the Jesuits and say, yes, that it does match up,
Mhm.
because the Jesuits or the religious people that had come over to prothesalize, they made notes and they were able to say, okay, it makes sense. It's oral. These guys made notes. It makes sense. So we have to remember that in First Nation stuff.
Yeah, and what's important to know too about it being orally recorded was history is not written in stone, much to popular belief, right? They're going
Correct.
back in time and they're interviewing people and pulling up journals and documents and reliving the stories which we know are so important to Aboriginals, and finding that our history is changing currently. So the British, what I just want to talk about is the British North America Act of 1867 gave federal government jurisdiction over Indian lands, not provincial government.
Correct.
And the Indian Act, you hear a lot of people talk about why it's discriminatory and how it was very outdated and how it oppressed the people. So that's why it had to be amended, correct?
So let me give you a little bit here. So 1867, as you know, is the year of Confederation. Um, when it was signed between the Upper and Lower Canada, a few of the provinces and the grout. But what the big thing is that um, with the Indian Act, and there's good there's pros and cons to the Indian Act, but the big thing is that what happened is that the Indians, for lack of a better term, became a ward of the federal government. So think of the federal government as being the parent and the children being the First Nations people. So it took their rights away. It said, you know what, you're going to follow under, we'll become your parent. We'll set up your rules and everything, period.
Mhm.
That's what happened there with the Indian Act. And that's why there's been a lot of struggle to change it or delete it, because the First Nations say, we are a nation, you set up treaties with us, so we need to talk on a same level, nation to nation, not parent to child.
Mhm. Correct. So let's go through to the next slide. So just talking about what treaties are in North America and why they're supposed to be mutually beneficial. And when they first started, Native people, the whole idea behind it was peace and friendship. They wanted to protect their land, the rights to live off of the land, and their culture. Correct.
Correct. Yeah.
And and the British wanted their land. So that was the original purposes of the treaty. So the First Nations people wanted to establish peaceful relationships and allow them to trade, use the passages that they've always did. And it, like you said, it was done orally and in ceremonies. And it was very culturally rich. but not, and for the government side, it was more of a legal document rather than relationship building, which it was for the Aboriginals, correct?
Hmm. And you've probably taught this in some of your social, and I keep bringing to the social classes you talked before when you talk about high context and low context cultures and stuff like that. Those that um, read the words and those that read between the words and the tone that it's set in. And like, you know, the map you have on the previous page there shows all the different First Nations there.
Mm-hmm.
It's, uh, we perceive them as being as one language, one faith. No, it's very, very, it's not linear like that.
Um, so basically the First Nations, because we said it's supposed to be mutually beneficial, they got their hunting rights, fishing rights, their reserved lands, being able to educate their people how they want, and they got health rights as well. So they were already becoming dependent on the government at this point, financially dependent. And the Crown got land for farming, settlement, natural resources. So at the start, the idea was that this was all going to be very peaceful. But what happened after that?
Well, it was
Where did this go wrong, possibly?
well, you know what? So back in the day when the French and English, you had the Hudson Bay Company, and I forget the French Canadian version or the French version of it though, but they had posts all along what we see as Canada today, and they eventually built a railway to connect the country. They wanted to settle it because the Americans, with their manifest destiny, wanted to move up and across, but they had all these posts. So the First Nations people would go out and you know, they would hunt and bring back furs and stuff like that. Eventually, when that stuff sort of settled down, they had no way. They learned this new way of supporting themselves and their family, right? So the culture, the interdependency with each other, the relationships with other First Nations has sort of started to fall apart, right? The fabric of what their life was. And this is where they start to become dependent upon the federal government for all this, uh, anything that you would want to live on, right?
Of
I mean,
course.
eventually, you know, if you when you guys talk about the schooling and that, eventually they were stripped of, you know, they wanted to kill the Indian out of the Indians at the end of the day, and there's a lot of reference, word for word, in many historical texts there.
Okay, I'm going to.
So this all goes back. Everything sort of can go back to the Royal Proclamation, Liz, of the previous page of 1867. You know, the king basically came in and said, "Look, you know what? We would like you to help us against the French and then the Americans, and by doing that, we will leave this land as yours, but we want the right to be able to populate it, to be able to create agriculture out of it." So everything goes back to then. Everything goes like their rights for education, no federal taxation, and so on and so forth. Goes back to 1867. And you know what? It's a document that was written. When people say, well, why they get this, why they get that? Well, if you believe in the rule of law, whether it's printed or oral or by handshake, it's an agreement that was made. We come from the crown. Canada comes from the crown. It's not, we didn't fight like the Americans and rebel against the British and set up our own. We're still part of that dominion. And this is why we have to abide by these treaties that we've completed in the past.
And even you hear some people say, well, that was a long time ago and I didn't do anything to you. My grandpa or my grandfather's father did it. It was so many generations ago. I don't really care about these issues anymore. But the fact of the matter is these issues are still happening today. Like look at just most recently the pipeline and all the protests and people who are uneducated about Aboriginal rights, or not uneducated, or just unaware of the history of it, are getting frustrated and mad with it about it. But if you go through history and look at what we have done over the years, and we're still doing it today with issues like this. So let's talk about, so in 1873 was one of the first cases that set precedents for land claims for Indigenous lands in Canada. And the Indigenous, what's interesting about this case is the Indigenous people were not represented and were not even involved in the litigation process. So basically what it was is it was in Northern Ontario. They entered into Treaty Number 3 with the federal government. So in 1873, which it says there. And Sir John A. Macdonald was acting in this capacity as the prime minister, and basically he oversaw the Indian Affairs Act. And he issued a timbering license to this St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company. The company cut 2 million feet of lumber, and the provincial government put an injunction to prevent further cutting of the lumber and its removal. So the fight here is between the provincial government and the federal government, because federal government has rights over native land, but it fell because of Treaty Number 3, it fell within the boundaries of Ontario. So the federal government was the defendant in this case, and its argument was that the Indians had owned the land and passed that ownership on to the federal government through Treaty Number 3. And in the British North America Act, it states that the responsibility of the Indians and the lands were reserved for the Indian falls onto the responsibility of the federal government. Mm-hmm. So it's quite interesting that our prime minister gave a lumbering company the right to go in and pull these natural resources, which have a lot of wealth, off of Indian land. The natives weren't even involved in this lawsuit. It just became a battle between the province and our federal government. Anyways, the decision still basically at the end of all of this is still, it went on for years and years, hundreds of years. It went until 1990, it was still amended, but basically it was everyone that appealed it, nobody took into consideration Indigenous rights. They basically, everyone agreed on these two issues, that Indigenous title to land existed, so it was theirs, as defined by the British law prior to that, the time of colonization, and the Crown must act in a clear and plain way to extinguish that title.
So what you have to remember here is why is the province involved, because natural resources under it was the B&A Act, now it's the Canadian Constitution Act, but resources fall under the purview of or jurisdiction of the provincial governments. However, this case gets messy because you have the provinces saying lumber is a resource, comes under our jurisdiction, but however, it's on native land. This native land, which was again going back to 1763 and whatnot, and 1867 as well, that we granted, or the Crown, i.e. the government granted the certain rights to First Nations for the land. So because they live on it and because they're on the federal jurisdiction, this became federal jurisdiction. And that's how, at the end of the day, this becomes them. Treaty Number 3. So let me tell you a little bit of a story about this. So you, instead of saying a tract of land with the name of the First Nations, they started doing Treaty 1, 2, 3, 4. So they would go somewhere back in the day because they were signing treaties. They wanted to meet First Nations that lived on those parcels of land, vast parcels, by the way. And if they didn't find them there, they said, okay, in the name of the Crown, we make a treaty, and this land is being ceded to the Crown. So that Treaty 1. So that's why a lot of these are named with our numerical names. Treaty 1, 2, 3. There's multitudes of them, but basically they would say, this is our land, nobody's here to claim it. Boom. Even though they would only go to the mouth of the river, it wouldn't go in to see the people. So a little bit of history there about how that come apart. But again, as I mentioned here, Aboriginal rights are covered on sections 35 of the Constitution Act. By the way, the Constitution was patriated or brought back from England by our present Prime Minister, his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, back then.
And what's interesting, like we have these birthday celebrations, Canada's 150, 100, but that's just, we're so much older than that. We need to take into consideration, add a couple zeros on that, and that's where our real history in Canada comes from.
100%. Yeah. I mean, they say that the history of the First Nations goes beyond European history.
Yep, that's correct. And what's really interesting and why I think it's important to preserve it is that when we think of Canadians, and I ask them all the students all the time in
Okay, I'm with you,
introduction
so
to
we're both
sociology.
saying wrong.
Pardon?
We're probably both saying this wrong.
Saying what wrong?
Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking about this here in
Oh,
Alabama.
no, no. Oh, yes. No, I was talking about culture. And when I ask the students in the introduction to sociology, I say, what does it mean to you to be Canadian? And people give out, hockey, Tim Hortons, fishing. We like the outdoors. We're very polite. But to be culturally rich, like I don't think I've ever known or read about any other culture that's as culturally rich in depth as the Aboriginal culture. And that's
Well,
why it's so important for them to keep it.
yeah, and there's a lot. And as you go on and research, you're going to find that there's a lot of real concentrated effort by the federal government to actually extinguish and actually kill the Indian out of the Indian through schooling and everything. We were pretty brutal. The religious schools were extremely brutal. I mean, when you read up what they've done, it's like, I mean, if you it's beyond. I mean, I can't even explain it. You know, we strip the parents of their kid when they're 5 years old. We take them somewhere. They don't come back for summers. They don't come back if somebody dies. They come back 13 years later after they've had no connection with their society, their culture, their parents. Some of them come back and there's no parents to come back to. A lot of died, ran away. I mean, it's bloody horrendous. It's like, I'm sorry to say it, but it's almost to the point of where it could be a genocidal crime.
Yeah. And with the whole goal of westernizing them.
Yeah, it is. It was.
So let's talk about land claims.
Hmm.
Would you mind talking about this? So, oh no, did I skip over your? No, I didn't. Go ahead.
So what? There's three types of land claims at the end of the day, and I'd encourage you to go, everybody. I'd encourage you to go on YouTube and look at. There's some really good videos on some of these as well. Always good to get a different perspective. But there's what we call comprehensive land claims. When we talk about comprehensive, we're talking about real large. So here's this based on the concept of continuing Aboriginal rights, and the title which have not been dealt with by treaty. Basically saying, there's a lot. So North America or Canada is an example. This is what our land mass is, okay? There's a lot of land still there that wasn't claimed by treaty between the Aboriginals and the Crown. They're saying, you know what? This land is still ours. We did not cede it. Title was not extinguished. This is what they mean by comprehensive land claims. Okay, that weren't dealt with treaty or in any other legal ways. Specific land claims are just as the term says, basically arising from alleged non-fulfillment of Indian treaties or other. Basically, a treaty was signed, an agreement was made. The First Nation was saying, we allowed you to use our land based upon the treaties, but you've done nothing back to reciprocate what you were supposed to do. There's been a ton of those going on. Some have been finalized. They've come to fruition. But there's still tons of other ones. When the Olympics were in Alberta 20 years ago, when they were in BC, I think maybe 7-10 years ago, there were still issues whether there's certain areas that were going to be used for the skiing as an example, because it traversed First Nations land. Other claims, which is the third category here, are claims which do not meet the strict acceptance criteria of the above two. Basically, they're saying anything that doesn't fall within the comprehensive land claims, which it wasn't addressed by a treaty or specific treaties. Other things that are going on come under what we call other claims. This is a big thing, and it's going to only get bigger and bigger as time goes. When you hear certain parts of the country want to cede, like when Jason Kenney's making rumblings out in Alberta, or when they used to make them, and some still do it in Quebec. The Aboriginals came, especially the Ojibwe or the Métis at West. They come up and said, "Hey, come here. You think you're going to cede from the country? Well, guess what? This land you say is yours is actually ours." So it's a very complex myriad of. It's just extremely. It's like a spider web. at the end of the day.
And when they're saying it's ours, it's because they trace back that they colonized, they were here first and they were populating it as well, right?
Yeah, and they go back to the treaties. It says that you promised ABC, and guess what? ABC didn't happen, right? So,
Okay. You want to talk
and
this case study?
yep. So the Marshall case, Marshall Jr. actually, he got charged. I think he caught like around 400 or 500 pounds of eel for his family, um, and he had been charged, shipping without fishing without a license. Okay. Nowadays, when you become, I don't know how old, 16 or 18, you got to buy a fishing license. You can only catch certain things. You can't catch things out of season. So basically, he was fishing out of season without a license. Well, maybe in season, but no license. He was arrested. He said, "Whoa, you know what? First Nations, we have the right to fish, and we have the right to fish for ourselves." The Supreme Court recognized this. He's part of the Micmac band. They basically recognized it and said, "You know what? He was unduly arrested. He has the right to fish, and he's not fishing for commercial, uh, uh, Liz, commercial
Commercially,
endeavor.
he's not
Basically,
selling it to, yeah.
yeah,
He's
he's feeding his own family, right?
mhm.
So this gets even worse with the lobster fisheries and that when they had to close them down 30 years ago. But the First Nations still had the right to fish because it was for themselves, not on a commercial basis. Caused a lot of issues, but again, it's because we don't understand the history. We don't want to. So there's been a lot of violence between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal fishermen. RCMP have been called in on the East Coast and the West Coast, actually, to say that. And there's still a lot of negotiations that are happening. But at the end of the day, their rights are now established in the Constitution Act of 1982, period.
Okay. We talked a little bit about this, the land claims. Let's go on to, can we talk a little bit about Caledonia? That's
Yeah.
our students
Yeah.
might remember that. It wasn't.
There's a couple of videos on there, but and I'm gonna ask you when you watch videos, make sure they're just objective videos and no political bias. But Haldeman and Norfolk. So in Woodstock, if you head west on the 403, east actually towards Brantford, and that go a little bit further. The Haldeman Grant. This goes back to 1784. I believe that somehow this land was given, not given to the land, but there was a treaty signed for it. Actually, even up here in the Grant River, the Brant River, it says that the Crown has the land as far as you can shoot a cannonball, which again is no way of measuring. But in 2006, and you can even look at the prices before, but 2006, a small part of the land there was sold to a developer, and he was putting up houses. So a small group of First Nations moved into the area that's called Douglas Creek Estates in Caledonia. They said this land here is an ancient burial site. It's sacred land. They basically moved in there. They closed everything up. They put up a barricade. Eventually, the OPP was called in. I don't know if this is Mike Harris was in this time as the federal provincial premier, but you got the feds and now the provinces both trying to see what they can do. So the OPP come in and raid. They sit and talk back and forth. Eventually, what happens is that there's a construction put on the ban, a ban on the construction. The government buys the land, and they go back and compensate the builder who spent so much money on this. But again, it's still not settled. It's just in stasis right now, is where it is to this day. Another big one is the Oka crisis up Quebec and Ontario way. Same thing happened. That was during the 1980s when Brian Mulroney was the prime minister. That big stand up between the two, and eventually one soldier got killed. And it's the women actually. And remember, First Nations is a matriarchal society, meaning the women, they're the chiefs in that.
They vote in the chiefs.
Right?
They vote in the chiefs,
Yeah, and they can,
and they can strip them of the power too.
right? But they're the ones that sort of stepped in and sort of brought down the peace. All right.
All right. Anything else about treaties or land claims or issues? Why these protests that are going on that people might not understand the reasons behind it?
Well, to make a general point, there's still a lot of claims across Canada that aren't worked to this day that are still out there moving. So anytime something's going to happen on First Nations land without notifying them and letting them know and working in with this, it's not going to work at the end of the day. So the government has learned that they need to involve them. But at the end of the day, you're right. It's still a dicey issue, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Fidel. I appreciate you joining in.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye.
Take care.